Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now, one of the most irritating things that a presenter can do is to say our guest today needs no introduction and then drone on for about 30 minutes about them. In this case, our guest really does need no introduction. It's the Right Honourable Jeremy Hunt MP for South West Surrey. But what does need an introduction is this series in the RSM. And I just want to remind you the RSM is an apolitical, it's a charitable organisation, and also that this is not Newsnight and I am not Emily Maitlis. I wish I was. My inspiration when we do these conversations is not her or Jeremy Paxman, but the late, great Anthony Clare, even though I am but a pale imitation. Now then, Jeremy, when we invited you to this event, it was back in a distant kind of golden age in December, as I recall, and the current crisis is not even a glint in the eye of a Chinese bat or pangolin. And this series is not like our lunchtime webinars, which are now solely focused on COVID. But the truth is, we cannot help but start, as we do most of our conversations at the moment, with the current crisis. But just to say to you and to everyone else, I definitely do intend, and we will move on to other topics, but we are where we are. So where you are, you're in the House of Commons, I think, as we speak, and you're the chair of the Health Select Committee now. Could you just explain a little bit about what that means and how our select committees work and what the role is?
Sure, and good evening, Simon. Good evening, everyone. You don't need to introduce me, I'm sure, to this audience, but you do need to pronounce my surname right, and you succeeded. And I have to say that hasn't always happened. So well done on getting over that very first hurdle.
Yeah, we had Evan Davis telling us the story in our first webinar, I'm afraid, so we're not going to repeat it. Well, yes, indeed, anyway, indeed. Health Select Committees.
Yes, do you know, when I put my name forward for that in January, I thought, this is going to be the quiet life. After 9 years of that intensity of being in the cabinet, I'm going to really enjoy getting stuck into some good health issues, but very much with a backseat role. And of course, it hasn't proved that way. And it's been personally, a big challenge for me, because the chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee in a pandemic has a very important constitutional role, which is to hold the government to account in a non-party political way. And I and the Select Committee, we are the non-partisan voices in Parliament to do that. And that has meant me, on frequent occasions, criticising the government's approach to the pandemic, and that's not been easy to me because I'm a natural loyalist. But, as you say, we are where we are, and I've had to learn pretty fast.
So I'm not sure, are you a poacher turned gamekeeper or the other way around? I'm never quite sure which way the cliche goes, but you're one or the other. And you have been very effective, including some people who've not necessarily been your greatest fans have been, actually noticing what you've been saying, and that you have not been, you've not been sticking to, well, you've been doing your job, I suppose. When did you first realize that things were not going perhaps as smoothly as we would all like?
Well, I think, at the start, I was very puzzled by the fact that all the public messaging that we were getting from the government and the government scientists was about a pandemic that was inevitably going to end up affecting 50, 60% of the population. I think it's very unfair to say that they embraced herd immunity, but they just thought it was inevitable that this was going to sweep through huge parts of the population, whereas the evidence from China, even Wuhan, was that less than 1% of the population had actually been infected before they were managing to turn things around. So I'm not an epidemiologist, but that struck me as a very puzzling contrast. And I think what I can see is that obviously I was health secretary for nearly 6 years when we were doing pandemic preparations, and I have to bear my share of the responsibility. But we were massively over-focused on pandemic flu and not thinking nearly hard enough about pandemic SARS. And coronavirus has turned out to be more similar to SARS than to flu. And there was a groupthink, not just in this country, but in America and many European countries as well, that basically continued to treat this as a pandemic flu. And we can see that the countries that treated it as a SARS have had spectacularly better results in terms of containing the virus and indeed containing the economic impact.
Fair enough. And already one person has already asked quite sensibly, really, just asking, you, of course, are no stranger to China and the Far East, and we'll come back to that later on. But they are asking, did the fact that you have some of the languages and you must, as Foreign Secretary, have had back channels into those areas, did you actually use any of those at that time?
No, I didn't. But I've always been, very interested in Asia.
Yeah.
And obviously, my wife is Chinese. That is a description I haven't always got 100% accurate in the past, but I can confirm that she is absolutely Chinese. Indeed. And I think the thing that has surprised me is actually the level of ignorance about Asia. So there was a sort of a view, for example, that some of the lockdown and social distancing measures that were being applied in Asia would never work here because Asians are just more obedient. And anyone who has any experience of Korea or Taiwan knows these are incredibly robust democracies. And the one thing you would never use if you were talking about a Korean is the word obedient. And so I think there are some sort of cultural perceptions, but I think probably the biggest reason that we didn't look closely enough about what was happening in Asia wasn't that. It was the fact that China is not a democracy. It doesn't share our democratic values. So there was a sense that it was very difficult. And also, of course, China had covered up the virus in the early days. So you put all that together and there was a sense that it was not really possible to learn too much from the way China was dealing with the virus. And I think that's understandable. But I think we should have been more open to what the other Asian democracies were doing, because there were really important lessons from them as early as January that we, at that stage, weren't really interested in learning from.
You're not seriously suggesting, and I think your points are well made, but you're not seriously suggesting that we could have gone exactly the same route as Korea, are you? I mean, clearly we'll talk about testing and they did that very differently, but they did other things as well. I mean, reading credit cards, using drones, sending people to track and trace, publishing a map who had it, using video surveillance, alarms going off on your phones, GPS systems. I mean, it was a massive intrusion on liberty. Well, do you think that would have been possible here, really?
I don't think we could have gone that far, and I wouldn't have advocated that. But remember, in January, people didn't believe that the British people would respect a lockdown. And the biggest reason why we hesitated on the lockdown was we thought people will only accept it for a very limited period of time, so we mustn't go in too early, because then just as we need people to be staying locked down, they'll be wanting to come out. And it wasn't until we saw it happening in Italy, a fellow European country, a fellow democracy, that we realized that actually people would subject themselves to a lockdown. So we made all sorts of behavioral assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. And I think when it comes to Korea, the principal reason that they were more effective, as we all now know, is they were doing test and trace right from the outset and they never stopped it. But actually, there are some, similarities to us. I mean, the Korean government in 2015 was castigated in Korea for the slow ramp up of testing when they had the MERS crisis, and they had to do a whole bunch of tests quickly. And they tried to do them through central laboratories. It took far too long, and they developed a protocol to tap into private sector laboratories so that they were able to ramp up testing much more quickly. And so I think it's a challenging question for me, as I say, as well, because I was health secretary when we did this huge Operation Cygnus on pandemic flu in 2016. That was the year after MERS. And, we'd had SARS in 2003. And yet we were still putting all our effort and energy into a flu response. And I think that the big thing that we need to think about is how to tackle the groupthink, really, that basically meant that Western countries, because we'd experienced flu and not SARS, based all our preparations around flu and not SARS.
Fair enough. And mentioning that exercise, I think I've noticed you get asked this question a lot because it was on your watch, as you said, Operation Cygnus. But I think we need to just delve a little bit more into that. Hugh Whitfield, who's a surgeon, one of our members, I don't know if you saw, he had a letter in the Telegraph yesterday, a paper that's normally pretty favourable to your party. Now, he says specifically, DH and PHE failed to act on its conclusions. And that's widely said. Is that a fair comment or not?
I don't think it is. And actually, the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Health and Social Care has confirmed to the Public Accounts Committee that all the recommendations from Cygnus were implemented. But the failing is that if you read those recommendations, there wasn't a single recommendation to ramp up testing. There wasn't a single recommendation to increase the PPE stockpile. It warned about the fragility of the social care system, but we didn't need Operation Cygnus to tell us that. And that we also had a lot of fragility in the NHS, and that was why I worked hard to get a long-term funding settlement for both sectors, and I succeeded for one, not for the other. But the truth is that Cygnus was a flu exercise, and we needed to build in resilience for other types of virus, and we didn't have that. And I think, right back in January, we can see now from the SAGE minutes that are published that ministers were presented with a full lockdown option or a kind of mitigated herd immunity option. But the South Korean test and trace approach wasn't even modeled as an option. And what I think the solution would be to publish the advice that SAGE is giving to ministers as closely as possible to the time it's given, so that it can be peer reviewed by all the other scientists in the country, rather in the way that the Monetary Policy Committee in the Bank of England, when they're giving advice on whether interest rates should go up or down, that advice is also published. You know which economists have argued for and against a rise in interest rates. And I think that opening up the advice that ministers are receiving, because it is independent scientific advice, would prevent or would help to prevent the risk of groupthink, which is clearly what happened on this occasion.
I mean, and we'll come on to that as well, but I just think in fairness to quite a few people now asking questions, there was a point in that report, and it wasn't just that it pointed out the frailties of the social care system, it was rather specific. It did say there would be problems if the NHS implemented its proposed reverse triage plans, which we know is what it did, and we know that it hadn't been worked through and has been part of the crisis in the care home system. So it wasn't a big finding, you're quite right, but it was in there. And maybe we just aren't in the habit of paying close enough attention until too recently to the social care implications. Do you think that's a kind of a fair comment, that our eyes were very tightly on the NHS side?
Yes. And I think you have to be fair to the people making decisions at that time in January, because our TV screens were full of what was happening in northern Italy and then what was happening in New York. And but at the time, if you remember, Patrick Vallance said that we are only 4 weeks behind Italy in the progression of the disease. We actually now think it was more like 2 to 3 weeks behind Italy. So, that was what people were worried about. And so it's absolutely right to take every measure we could to empty out hospitals and create capacity. And that actually has been one of the great triumphs of the coronavirus response, the fact that not a single patient was denied a ventilator or an intensive care bed. It's a huge, huge achievement for the NHS in its single biggest test. But as part of that, hospitals discharge people to care homes who weren't symptomatic, but they weren't tested. And you compare that to countries like Germany that had rules in place that said that care homes were not allowed to accept people from hospitals unless they could quarantine them for 2 weeks. So Germany too didn't have the testing available at that stage, but they said you have to quarantine people coming in from hospitals. You compare it to Korea, where they offered to increase the pay of care home workers if they moved into the care home, so that you found a way of breaking the chain of transmission between care homes and the community. You compare it to Hong Kong, where they had not a single care home death, but they didn't have a single infection in a care home, because they'd learned from SARS and MERS, and every care home had a 3-month stockpile of PPE, and they banned visitors at a very early stage. So I think you're right. I think we were thinking too much about hospitals, and I think, what's the lesson from this? The lesson is that the one thing that has to come out of this terrible crisis is a long-term settlement for the social care system, proper funding, proper integration with health. I fought very hard when I was arguing for the 20 billion rise in the NHS budget. I said, we've got to do the same for the social care sector. We need to have a 10-year plan, a long-term funding settlement. And I was told it has to come afterwards. We'll do the NHS first, and then we'll do the social care system. And then I moved to the Foreign Office, but that was 2 years ago. We've just got to do this now. It is absolutely essential.
Okay, but let's still stick, because you've been very active recently. You had an excellent interview with Nick Robinson in the, what they call political thinking. And I've been listening to you on the FT as well. You've been busy, and it's not just you, lots of people are developing a narrative that is being critical of the scientific advice given to government at the start of this. And it's fair enough to be critical, nothing wrong with that at all. I have a slight conflict that I was on Sage some years ago. Thank God, nothing much happened. But I'm very friendly with many of those who are. And I'm sure you'll agree, these are all working unbelievably hard in an incredibly stressful situation. I'm just wondering what you would have them do differently. Some people have been critical of epidemiological modelling, but the opposite of modelling, is what? It's, if you don't do that, it's guesswork or Mystic Meg.
I've actually said in the House of Commons that I think that Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance are absolutely outstanding, and any government is lucky to have them advising it. So this is not about pointing any fingers. I think what you have to do is to look at the systems we had, and I think politicians and scientists have to share responsibility for our response, including the politicians who were in office before this happened and were responsible for the preparations, such as myself. So this is not about pointing any fingers at all. I think we just have to understand that in Western countries, in Europe and America, with the possible exception of Germany, there was a kind of groupthink that meant that we were thinking flu, not thinking SARS, and that was at the heart of why our response has been less effective than other countries in Asia. So this is not, I don't think, at all about pointing any fingers. But what I think matters is that we look forward, we say, what are the solutions? And I think more transparency on scientific advice. I also think, as you know, my main focus as health secretary was on patient safety. And there are a massive amount of lessons from patient safety. The main way that we're going to deal with the huge number of appalling avoidable deaths and harm in modern healthcare systems is to have an open and transparent culture where our primary focus is learning from mistakes and not blaming people. And we still have that blame culture. So I think that was very apparent in coronavirus, where we weren't good enough at learning from what was happening in other parts of the world. The only difference in a pandemic is that time is absolutely critical. There's a Chinese scientist who said that if they had locked down in Wuhan a week earlier, the number of people getting the virus would have been reduced by 2/3. So you just don't have the time in a pandemic. In the normal patient safety debate, when we're talking about, halving maternity deaths, you want to do it as quickly as you can, but you don't have exactly the same time pressure. And I think that's one of the big things that you have to learn.
No, and all fair points. But equally, speaking as on the epidemiology side myself, but presumably you would also agree that, and what I've also heard from my colleagues, is that perhaps not all the politicians were giving it their full attention at the same time as well. I mean, I would suggest that it's certainly not a one-way street here, Jeremy, that you also have to have people who are prepared to listen to the advice and test it. And maybe that also didn't happen as smoothly as it should.
You do. I mean, as a politician, you've absolutely got to look at the scientific advice you've been given, be prepared to challenge the assumptions that are being made. But in the end, it's incredibly difficult if you're given two options, you know, not to think that it's got to be one of those two options that's the way forward. So, as I say, I personally think this is not a time to be pointing fingers at anyone at all. I think, you know, one of the things you learn in human factors training is that the most important thing is to look at the systemic risk and the systemic failures. And we went down a certain track along with many other countries. And we just need to ask ourselves how we're going to make sure that doesn't happen in the future.
One difference, you mentioned Germany several times, and quite rightly so. Both Macron and Merkel did talk directly to their scientists. I don't know how the conversations went, but they made a point of getting to know them a bit more personally. And Merkel, of course, has the advantage because she was a scientist herself. Do you think that was also a problem, that there wasn't the direct contact maybe that there should have been to develop the trust between the two? Because it's not just a question of politicians trusting scientists. Scientists also have to trust politicians.
I don't think you could really level that accusation at Boris or Matt. I think that the scientific advisors have been in and out of Downing Street the whole time throughout this crisis. And I think there has been enormous numbers of conversations, so many conversations, in fact, that they all caught the virus off each other and no one knows who got it first. So I think there has been a high degree of contact.
Okay. And I mean, I know you're talking to the German foreign minister on Friday, aren't you? Again, we should just point out that Mrs. Merkel, who, you know, clearly Germany handled the crisis well, but she was also talking at the start of 60 to 70% of Germans need to get this virus. So it wasn't just us who were playing around partly with maybe these ideas, but so was Angela Merkel. It was not just unique to us.
I think she's an absolutely amazing statesman. I have to say, that bell is just for the adjourning of Parliament, by the way. I'm not going to have to disappear and leave you to ad-lib for a few moments.
No, you did that to the FT. Thank God you're not doing it to me.
But I actually remember that I met Angela Merkel on my very first day as Foreign Secretary, and the whole thing was a bit of a blur. But the first thing she said to me was, it was in the middle of all the Brexit agonies, she said, congratulations on your new job, if that's the right word. And she's got a very sort of dry sense of humour. But, you know, I thought that's a very important point, Simon. It wasn't just us. I mean, Germany too. I think we will discover, but this is a hunch, I haven't got any scientific evidence for this, but I think we'll discover the reason the German death rates are so much lower than ours is principally because they had better processes in place to protect people in care homes. People talk about the fact they carried on testing and tracing, and I think that may be partly responsible as well, but I think it's most likely to be the policies around care homes. So I think, you know, the concept of needing to get to herd immunity was very widespread at that time.
Yeah. I mean, I remember on the day Claire, my wife, who you know, was tested positive, there was a really confusing week. And I was told myself that I didn't need to isolate or stay in quarantine because I was well. And I mean, there was no chance of that happening, of course. But there was a week or two in which there was very confusing messaging. And I'm sure that will appear as we go along. One last question then on this, though. Again, a lot of people are pointing the fingers at PHE, Public Health England, at the moment, and today's announcement about the Joint Biosecurity Centre is hardly a vote of confidence. And again, first thing, which I'm sure you will agree completely, is this is very sad. There are undoubtedly absolutely first-class people working there, many of them good friends, but nevertheless, everyone seems to be lining up to take pot shots at them. Is that fair play?
Well, I wouldn't want PHE to become a scapegoat. I was responsible for the setting up of PHE because I inherited Andrew Lansley's Act, and it was created by that 2012 Act. And I don't by any means think that all the structures created by that Act were optimal. And we've we could have a longer discussion about that, I'm sure.
Well, yes.
But I think that my experience of dealing with PHE is that they were very cooperative and supportive to the Department of Health when I was there, and generally tried to do what they could to support the Health Secretary of the day. So again, I think it would be a mistake to look at an organisation. You know, the real reason that we didn't ramp up testing early was because under a flu strategy, you only do test and trace at the very early stages, and then there's no point doing it anymore. That was the reason. It wasn't because PHE were refusing to ramp it up. So I think we've got to be careful not to draw the wrong conclusions. That's not to say that it might not be necessary to reform PHE as we look at the structures of all our health organisations. I'm not arguing against reforming, but I just think that in this case, we've got to be careful not to create a scapegoat.
No, and I'd agree with that. And now I also know that you inherited the Health and Social Care Act, which is in this household not necessarily seen as a thing of beauty. And it's not done, it's the etiquette. I'm not going to ask you to criticise your predecessor, because I'm sure you won't. But judging by your actions, you weren't totally enamoured with all that. And I just wondered, looking back, do you think that you could have done more to get PHE into a better position to handle the crisis when it finally came those years later? Because my impression on them is the poor things were just utterly overwhelmed, just the sheer size of it.
Well, I think, you know, the real gripe people have with PHE is that we were slow to ramp up testing. Mm. But I think we saw that when we decided we wanted to ramp it up, and Matt put his huge political weight behind ramping it up, we did it in 4 weeks. So I think, it was really about not deciding until quite late on. I don't think SAGE started looking at test and trace until late March from memory. So it was really quite late in the process that they looked at a kind of national strategy of test and trace, Korean style. And so that, I think, is the heart of it. So I just, look, I'm not saying PHE doesn't need to be reformed. I just think we've got to be careful not to persuade ourselves that it was a wholly institutional failing by PHE, when I think there were more profound things that went wrong.
And finally, I mean, test and trace has to be the future. We all agree with that. But even that, you've been critical of that, quite rightly so. I mean, it still isn't working as it should.
Well, the fundamental issue with test and trace is that, Korea, Taiwan, Germany, they all introduced it and stuck with it when the infection rates were at a much lower level. We introduced it when our infections were running at around 4,000 to 5,000 new ones a day. And we are at the moment only feeding into the test and trace process around a quarter of those infections. And the real question, if we're going to get it to work at that higher level of community transmission, is how you pick up more of the asymptomatics that we don't know about. And actually, the analysis that I've seen that's been most persuasive on this is what's been done by Tony Blair and his organisation, which basically says you have to look at some kind of mass testing programme. And so the reason that I've been championing weekly testing for NHS staff, for example, and I'm pleased that it has now been introduced for care home staff, is not just because many NHS staff want to have the comfort of knowing that everyone in their organisation is being tested on a regular basis and that therefore they're unlikely to be passing it on to patients. But it is because healthcare settings are amongst the most likely areas where the infection is going to breed. And so, I think looking at healthcare staff, looking at taxi drivers is another group. Airport arrivals is another group. I think we need to think about mass testing amongst groups of the population as well as parts of the country like Leicester and so on, as our best way of finding out where the asymptomatics are and feeding them into the system so that their contacts can be isolated. And
on that last, I'm going to move on now, but just one last thing someone's asked, and I think it's a fair thing, because politics is a baffling to the outsider. And you on the 24th of June wrote a piece in the Telegraph, clearly asking for weekly testing of NHS staff patients. But they're pointing out the next day, you voted against that when that motion was in front of the House. I'm sure there are political reasons for this, but it does make it a bit difficult for the non-politician to understand how government and parliament works sometimes.
You know, I have to make a judgment as to the best way that I can persuade my Conservative colleagues to change their approach. So I gave a very forthright speech in the House of Commons supporting weekly testing for staff. But had I then gone and voted with a Labour motion, which incidentally had no legal force, my judgment was that I would be less listened to by the powers that be, not more listened to. And so, and the fact that a week later, weekly testing was introduced for care home staff, which was half of what I was calling for, suggests to me that that approach was the right one.
Okay, but I mean, there is groupthink in Parliament, just as there is in science and all other parts of human life. I think is a reasonable fact.
It is, but that wasn't groupthink. That was a calculation as to the most effective way of persuading the government that they needed to change their policy.
Okay. Now then, this isn't just about COVID. We do that at lunchtime, so I want to move on. We'll end up back where we started, but let's go back to you. I actually didn't know this, but you were actually born in Kennington, which is where I'm talking to you from now. So you're a South Londoner.
I am. I've lost the accent over some time.
Yes, I don't think we've ever had it with you.
My mum was a nurse at St Thomas's, and so that was the connection.
Yeah, and I don't know if you're talking about your background, you actually have something in common. I don't know if you know this, but with Sarah Wollaston, your predecessor on the Health Select Committee when it comes to parents. Do you know what that connection is?
I'm not sure I do actually. No.
Okay.
Tell me.
Well,
this is your life moment, is it?
It is, yes. This is a big reveal. Both of your parents were Navy and both met in Malta.
Ah, right. Well, of course, in that case, we have a connection with you as well through Claire. But
yes, yes, indeed. Yeah, Malta figures bigly.
When my mum, she left St Thomas's and went on to become a naval nurse, and that was where she met my dad. So yeah, that's absolutely right.
And though your father wasn't just in the Royal Navy, he was incredibly senior, Vice Admiral. He was in charge of the nuclear deterrent at one point. I mean, he obviously had a big influence on you, but you can't have seen, if it's a typical naval family, you can't have seen that much of him in your formative years.
Well, he went away to sea for long periods, it's true, but he was a wonderful, loving dad when he was at home. And, you know, it's true to say he was a very big influence on my life. He was the least military person you could ever imagine. He was a big champion of the underdog. He had very unconventional military views. He thought that naval officers should be trained to disobey their bosses. And when they did disobey their bosses, they should not be punished. Because he thought there was a real danger in every... He thought the great strength of the Royal Navy was when Nelson put his blind eye to the telegraph and disobeyed orders. And he thought that was what was the reason why we have been successful in winning battles over our history. So he was a fairly unconventional military type. And I think if you met him, you wouldn't have known that he was in the military unless he told you.
Yeah, you can normally spot eventually. You usually can, but yeah. But and that was in your home life as well. He was a very forgiving character, I think would be fair to say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, was he very forgiving? Yes, he was. I mean, they were wonderful parents. You know, he died 6 years ago, and so he's not with us. But they provided a nest that me and my brother and sister felt able to go back to throughout our adult lives. And I remember one of my hairiest moments in politics was during the Leveson inquiry, when I was accused by the world of conspiring with Rupert Murdoch, which hadn't happened. And fortunately, Lord Justice Leveson recognised that. But in the middle of it all, I was advised that after my appearance before the inquiry, I needed to leave London because the press were camping outside my front door. And I couldn't think where to go. And I thought, well, I have to go to Mum and Dad's. And so I arrived back home after this big moment. And it felt like, I don't know if you remember that comedy, Sorry, where Ronnie Corbett is living at home, even though he's in his 40s. I felt like, you know, Timothy from Sorry arriving home after all this time. But yeah, I'm very lucky to have two wonderful parents.
And then you do well, you go to Oxford, you read PPE. Ironically, of course, PPE doesn't mean now what we think PPE should mean. Everyone thinks personal protective equipment. I mean, actually, just thinking aloud, it would have been. Do you think that it would have been better if you'd read the other PPE, something in physics, psychology, or engineering at university? And
well, you know, when that question is asked by you, Simon, what on earth can I possibly reply? Look, I majored in philosophy. That was, of the three subjects, that was the one that I found most interesting. I'm happy with what I studied. I could have done classics, actually. That would have been my alternative. But no, I got a lot out of the subject.
Okay. But, I mean, your successor also read PPE, your chancellor does, all sorts of, and then I don't think there are any scientists, hardly any in the House now, and none in the cabinet.
No.
A reasonable comment.
But I did a job where I was surrounded by an awful lot of doctors and scientists for a major part of my life. And I came to have enormous respect for the people that I dealt with.
Okay. So let's move on then to that period. You're Britain's longest serving United Secretary of State for Health, 2012 to 2018. And on this, I mean, we're going to have to ask about two. I want to really ask you about two issues. One difficult and one less so. But it's impossible not to mention you will always be associated with the junior doctor strike, whether you like it or not. Looking back on that now, how does that make you feel? What emotions does this bring out in you?
Well, you can't choose your battles in politics, and I could point out that contract that caused the strike doesn't appear to have had any significant difficulties, and I could point out there's a Secretary of State, when you're faced with a union that tells its members they're going to have a 30 to 50% cut in their pay, when that's not the case, you can't back down. But the truth is, you can say all those things. I just wish it hadn't happened. And I asked myself whether there was any way that I could have prevented that happening. But I think the battle lines got drawn very soon. And the sadness for me was that what I cared about as Health Secretary was patient safety and reducing the number of avoidable deaths. And it made it much harder for me to communicate with an absolutely essential part of the NHS workforce on that very important issue because of the bitterness that happened as a result of the strike. So it was a massive, massive shame that it happened.
I mean, do you think perhaps you actually did get too involved in it? And some people say you did personalize it too much in that sense. Perhaps if you had left it to others, you would have been able to pursue other agendas that were more suited or that would have been more comfortable for you.
You can talk about tactics. I'm someone who believes in leading from the front. And, I took the decision that contract needed to be changed. And so I wasn't going to leave it to someone else to stick up for it. But I think, what I learned from that was, very early on, the BMA balloted its members and 98% said they supported strike action. And battle lines were drawn, and we ended up, I think, getting into a very destructive fight that lasted the best part of a year, which neither side really wanted to be in. And it was, as I say, for me, the sadness was that the thing I really cared about, which was reducing avoidable harm and death and patient safety, that was a very, very difficult message to communicate with that audience because of what was happening with the strike. But I'm not sure even now, when I go over what happened, whether it would have been possible to avoid it. But I certainly wish it hadn't happened.
Okay, and there are a lot of questions coming in on that. And as I said, I don't, there are other things as well I do want to talk about. And I think on the other side, you took a personal interest from the start in the issue of patient safety. That's a completely non-controversial statement. You took on mid-staffs, and that I think will be the second thing that you'll be remembered for as Secretary of State. Were you surprised that you picked up that particular baton?
Well, you got to kind of try to imagine what it's like when you become Health Secretary. You're responsible for the fifth largest organization in the world. If it was a country, it would have the 33rd largest GDP in the world. This enormous organization, and I didn't know a lot about it. I've been an NHS patient, campaigned for my local hospital, but I wasn't in any way an expert. And you're wondering what to focus on. And the first thing I had to deal with was mid-staffs. And I remember David Nicholson saying to me that I had to understand that in healthcare, 10% of patients get harmed. And I said, well, how many people die? And being the NHS, we've got lots of studies, and the Hogan and Black study said that 3.6% of hospital deaths have a 50% or more chance of being avoidable, which when you do the maths is about 150 avoidable deaths every week. And this was kind of accepted in the system as being just the cost of doing business. And that just jumped out at me as something that didn't feel right. And, I look back and, I introduced Ofsted ratings for hospitals, which I think has led to a lot more focus on patient safety, duty of candor, the Freedom to Speak Up Guardians, the Harvard maternity campaign, HSIP, GIRFT, lots of measures. But the truth is the job's not done. And you look at today's report by Julia Cumberledge and some of the horrific stories. It actually reminds me of one of the most traumatic encounters I had with a patient when I was Health Secretary, which one of the Morecambe Bay families. There was a father called Carl Hendrickson who lost not just his daughter, but his wife as well because of an accident in their maternity care. And the day before a statement to Parliament, he came to see me with some of the other Morecambe Bay families. And he brought his 11-year-old son, Conrad, with him. And my staff said he's brought his son. And I said, well, why don't you offer to talk to his son while we have the meeting, because it's going to be a bit grim. And so they offered that. And they said, no. He said he wants his son to be in the meeting with him. And I realized as he was sitting there that he wanted his son to know that he had gone right to the man at the top to challenge why it was that his wife and his daughter had died. And the enormity of these things that go wrong just never leave you. And so I really hope that what the harrowing stories we heard from Julia Cumberledge today are properly absorbed, and we do every single thing that she's asked to be done, because there is a lot more to do.
There is, Matt Discombe has just asked a question about Julia Cumberledge's report, actually. And as you say, it came out this morning. And as you say, it's pretty harrowing. Do you want to just explain, first of all, you asked for this report, what the background to that report is?
Yes, I mean, we had a series of problems. So we had problems with, a minority of hospitals not delivering safe care in certain areas, and that led to, Morecambe Bay, Southern Health, mid-staffs, and so on. But we uncovered towards the end of my time as Health Secretary a slightly different problem, which is a problem that with medical devices and medicines that were having unintended side effects or unexpected side effects, we didn't seem as a system to be acting properly. And the two examples were vaginal mesh and sodium valproate. And then there was a big debate about whether Primodos was also one of those medicines. So I asked Julia Cumberledge and Sir Cyril Chandler to look into this. And they uncovered the fact that people who've been suffering with problems with meshes, with sodium valproate, just hadn't had anyone to go to. And when they tried to go to someone, no one really was interested in taking up their stories. And so they've said that we need to have a patient safety commissioner, someone whose job it is to listen to stories like that and make sure that the system make sure that there is somewhere in the system those people have to go to, which I think is a very powerful idea. And as I say, it's one I hope we implement.
And yet this has happened despite all the changes that you and others have been made. Thomas Jones here is saying that the Commonwealth Review today recognises that candour is still a challenge.
Yes, I think we've made a lot of progress. I think the duty of candour works well, is definitely improvement on where we were. I think the freedom to speak up guardians have actually proved incredibly important even during the coronavirus crisis. The idea that people working in hospitals have got someone independent, not their line manager, that they can contact if they've got a patient safety concern. I think they've been very effective. I think the CQC regime, I'm sure it's not perfect, but I think it's shone a spotlight on the variation in the quality of care in the system, and a lot of safety issues are much more prominent as a result. But you do all these things, and then you look at something like our neonatal death rate, and you see that if we had the neonatal death rate that they have in Sweden, 1,000 more babies will be surviving every year. And you know, we've got the Ockenden Review into Shrewsbury and Telford that will be coming up probably next spring. Yeah. And you realise this is something you can just never let up on. You've just got to keep going. Mental health is an area you and I, Simon, could talk about, you know, an awful lot. I think we've made, you know, a lot of progress on suicide prevention, but you'll be the first to say there's a huge amount that can be improved in crisis care.
Yes, that's true. But the HSJ mentioned today, actually, an interesting point about companies. Now, normally when a report comes out like that, you know, everybody wades in. The think tanks do, the colleges do, the BMA do, the Royal College of Nurses do. You know, this is a kind of a big reaction. But Alistair McClellan points out that it has been surprisingly quiet. You must have noticed that yourself. You wrote a piece this morning in the Indie. There's been a couple in the trade journals, Epilepsy Today, I've noticed, a little bit of TV and Sky, but not the reaction that one would expect. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's just now impossible to criticize the NHS?
No, I don't think it's that at all. I think it's something different, which is that the newspapers know that the public have a huge appetite for health stories because it's, for all of us, it is the single most important issue. But we are in a period where the public have had rather a lot of health stories for different reasons. And you know, there are other things that people are reading about. You know, you can't control whether there's a pandemic or not when you publish these reports. That doesn't mean that what they contain is any the less important. And, you know, there's only 9 recommendations, I think, in Julia's report. And, you know, we need to look at each of them very, very carefully, because when you read the stories of those families, they jump out at you. They are truly horrific.
Okay. Certainly, Alistair was wondering if it is now very difficult, and maybe for some time, to do anything negative about the NHS and this idea of NHS heroes.
But I would challenge the idea that this is negative about the NHS. I mean, what we want is the NHS to be the safest, highest quality healthcare system in the world. And that means that we want to be the most transparent in the world when things go wrong. That's what will make us the very best. So I see it as a strength of our system that we are surfacing these things. I don't for a moment think that they don't have issues such as the ones in Julia's report in France, Germany, America, or Japan. But I think we are one of the countries. In fact, I think I would even go further and say that we're quite used now to surfacing reports about problems in our healthcare system. And I think that's a strength, because we've got used to being open about it. And, you know, compare that to the fact that it took 4 years for the problems at mid-staffs to emerge before anything was done about it. And I think, you know, there's been a big change in our culture towards openness and transparency.
Okay. So again, you were the longest serving health secretary. You survived 3 reshuffles, I think. I think it was 3. Once it was announced by Laura Kusenberg that you actually had lost your job, but you hadn't. So you're a great survivor. But eventually you moved to the Foreign Office, which was a big change. And am I right in thinking that your first meeting was with Donald Trump? or pretty much your first?
The very first world leader I met was Angela Merkel.
Oh, you said that's true.
As I mentioned. Yes, that week I became Foreign Secretary, Trump came to England on his way back from the NATO summit at Brussels.
Yeah.
And my first encounter with him was actually because I did an interview the night before on Fox News in which I defended his demand that European countries pay more towards their defence. I'm a supporter of the NATO alliance, and I'm worried that it ultimately will break up if Europe doesn't pull its weight. And I then the next morning, the Foreign Office minder I had with me took me aside after that interview, and he was worried that I'd been too pro-Trump. And he said, Foreign Secretary, you must remember that quite a lot of British people do watch Fox News. And, you know, he was a bit jumpy about it. But the next morning, I was waiting at Chequers with Theresa May to greet Trump. And he came bounding over to me, grabbed my hand and said, "Great interview." So I was all puffed up. And then he turned around and said, "I said to my guys, I've got no idea who the hell this guy is, but he's doing a great interview." Actually, from that moment on, I got on fine with him. Not to say I agree with him on everything that he says or does, but it is one of the jobs of the Foreign Secretary to get on with the American administration.
Well, no, that's a fair point. But from Merkel to Trump, it surely is the sublime to the ridiculous in a very short space of time. You probably won't answer that one. Many people.
I've still got a bit of the diplomat left inside me.
Yes,
Simon, from my time there.
And then it turns out, unknown to many people, you're a very good linguist, and you gave a speech in Japanese, which I think was very well received, again, by people not necessarily great fans of yours, but had to tip the cap a bit. But I mean, you know, you did make possibly the most undiplomatic move of your entire life, getting Lucia's nationality wrong. How on earth did you manage that?
Well, what actually happened was that it was my first visit outside Europe, and I was in China, very important country for us in all sorts of ways, lots of very tricky issues, as we all know. And so I made some careful notes, and one of the notes I made, which I had in front of me, was what's the small talk I'm going to do with Wang Yi, who's the Chinese foreign minister. And I had two bits of small talk lined up. First is wife Chinese, and the second is like me, he spoke Japanese. And I had these two notes in front of me, and I misread them. And what happens is that at the start of these meetings, there's a wall of photographers and TV cameras just to film you getting underway. And then after a few minutes, they leave. And so I made this faux pas, and I thought, I'm sure the cameras are gone. And I turned around, and there was this wall of cameras, obviously delighting in this absolutely appalling gaffe. But the worst thing about it was, Simon, that China is 8 hours ahead of the UK. So this was actually at sort of 2 o'clock in the morning, UK time. So it was like a slow motion train crash as I waited for this story to break. And of course, the thing that terrified me most was Lucia finding out. And I was desperate to call her before she heard it on the news. And eventually I got through to her, and she picked up the phone and went, "Konnichiwa, darling," which is hello in Japanese. So I'm lucky to have a wife with a great sense of humor.
Yeah. But obviously there was lots of serious moments as well. And I don't know if it was you, but someone said that about being Foreign Secretary, it's a complicated job because the public says that they seem to think your job is to be mean to foreigners. On the other hand, the Foreign Office itself thinks your job is the exact opposite, to build bridges and to be diplomatic. Which is it?
I think the only way you can deal with that is be straight talking, and as far as you possibly can, say the same things in private as you are in public. So, you know, when you're with the Chinese, you know, you have to be absolutely clear that you tell them that you have concerns about what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or what's happening in Hong Kong, or what's happening with human rights lawyers. And likewise with the Saudis. But you have to likewise be honest with the British public that we have to have diplomatic relations with countries with which we may not agree, because that is how the world works, and you need to talk to everyone. But the privilege of that job is actually not the world leaders that you meet. It is the extraordinary individuals who've changed the world despite being an ordinary person. So, someone like Richard Radcliffe, who is Nazanin's husband, who has been suffering enormously. He's the most incredibly brave campaigner. He completely ignored the Foreign Office advice not to go public about Nazanin's arrest. And the result of that courage is that the whole world knows that Iran is taking these hostages. And that is brave to do that. Another one I met with a medical link actually is an extraordinary man called Denis Mukwege, who set up a hospital for women who've been raped in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He's a middle-class doctor, could have earned his living like his friends, just treating other middle-class people. He chose to set up this amazing hospital, Pansy Hospital, and has become a campaigner against sexual violence in conflict. So for me, that is the privilege of being Foreign Secretary, to meet those kind of extraordinary people.
And then, Jeremy, you spoiler alert here, for anyone who doesn't want to know the result, look away now. You entered the campaign to become the Prime Minister, and you lost, as we know. You must have been, I'm really fascinated to learn, you must have been tempted at that time, to think, okay, that's it now. You've lost the red boxes, you've lost the security data, the staff, the drivers, you're out of government. It's widely reported that you and Dominic Cummings are not the best of friends. You must have thought, I'm just giving this up for a game of soldiers. Why on earth didn't you?
Well, I actually found, to my surprise, that I really enjoyed that leadership campaign, because it is just a wonderful thing to be able to say exactly what you think needs to happen in the country without having to follow any kind of party line. And it was a privilege to do so. But one of the moments in that campaign, we had to get around the whole country very quickly to do all these hustings. And in order to make the logistics work, Conservative campaign headquarters often laid on helicopters for me and Boris to go from one part of the country to another. And on one of those trips, I think it was from Guildford to York, they said I could take Lucia and my son, Jack, neither of whom had been in a helicopter before. So it was a great thrill for me to take them on that ride. And I sat and I looked at my son, who was 9 then, and I thought, I have been in the cabinet for every single minute that he's been alive. And of course, the same is true for his 2 younger sisters. And I thought about that, and I would have loved to have stayed as Foreign Secretary if Boris had wanted me, but I understand that Prime Ministers have to choose who they want for these roles. But if it wasn't going to be that, I thought, I'm going to step aside and spend some time on the backbenches with my family and try and be a slightly better dad or husband than I was before. But why didn't I go completely? It actually goes back, I don't know if I've said this to anyone before, but it actually goes back to what we were talking about on patient safety, because the first campaigner I met was someone called Julie Bailey, who was one of the big mid-Stafford's campaigners. And I met her in a hotel room near Stafford, and I'd just become health secretary. And I'd kind of been warned to be careful of her. She was sort of seen by some people in the Department of Health as a troublemaker. And she grabbed me by the arm, she looked me in the eye, having told me about all the horrific things that happened at mid-Staffs, and she said, Jeremy, you could be the person who changes this. And I haven't changed it. There are lots and lots of things that I did which I'm very proud of. 3 million more patients using good or outstanding hospitals now compared to when I started. But there's so much that hasn't happened, as we've seen from Julia's report today, as we've seen from, as we'll see from the Ockenden report into Shrewsbury and Telford. And I really want to finish that journey on patient safety. So I'm writing a book on it. That's why I decided to put my hat in the ring to be chair of the Health Select Committee. I'm working with the World Health Organization on a 10-year action plan. We have now got World Patient Safety Day, which is something that I campaigned for and happens on the 17th of September every year. And that is the job that I want to finish. And it's a great privilege to be able to do it. And it's a great pleasure to be able to do it without the pressures of being a cabinet minister.
Okay. So the wheels come full circle. One last question to one Leslie Reagan has asked. I think it's the Leslie Reagan, and it's a question I was going to ask anyway, which is this: as we move out of the crisis, so you've written a lot on how the health service will change and things like that. But I just wondered your last thoughts. What things do you think we don't need to do anymore that we seem to have got by without during the last 6 months when the health service has been put under pressure but has survived? What things do you think we could row back on? Perhaps we don't need as much.
I think there are the obvious things that we're all going to benefit from, like much greater use of technology. I think it's going to be a real boon for patients, actually, that have mobility problems, not to have to go in physically to their GP surgery, although obviously there'll need to be face-to-face consultations as well. But I think the thing that I wonder whether we could do without are these aggregated national targets. As I've been writing my book on patient safety, I've been looking hard and trying to understand the pros and cons of a target culture. And I'm not someone who thinks we should scrap targets. I think that it's very important that we have standards that say that people shouldn't wait more than 4 hours for their A&E treatment or 18 weeks for their elective care. So I'm not against standards. But when you add up the score for every hospital in the country and turn it into a single aggregated national target, you end up with a massive amount of top-down direction from the Department of Health and NHS England. And we're the only country in the world that does that. And I think in terms of patient safety, what it does is it elevates the speed of service above the quality and safety of service, because it becomes the thing that matters more than anything else. And so, as I say, I'd like to keep them as standards, but I'm not sure whether the way we aggregate them is positive.
I think Leslie is hoping you might have said we could ease back a little bit on the CQC or appraisals or other issues of bureaucracy. But anyway, we'll leave it at that.
I think I'm sure we can reform how the CQC work, but I would be against removing the Ofsted rating system, because that has created an inbuilt transparency, which I think has been a huge...
Hopefully she'll settle for reform. Okay. And then the last question is for you. You know, having watched your career, you're not the same person you were in 2012. You're not even the same person you were in 2018. What do you think, looking back, is the thing that's most changed in you?
I think you get wizened by your experiences and actually humbled by your experiences. I was trying to think of the single most amazing moment that I had as health secretary. And there were plenty of challenging moments, and you've alluded to a few of them, but there were also an incredible number of wonderful moments. And I think the single most extraordinary moment was when I went to Papworth to look at a heart operation, and I watched someone's heart stop beating. It's just like an extraordinary thing to watch them winding down someone's heart, and then this kind of Heath Robinson contraption that's keeping the blood pumping while they do the operation on the heart. And then half an hour later, I went back into the operating theatre, and they said, now we're going to start it up again. And I saw the heart start beating again. And it was an incredible moment. I'm sure a totally routine moment for a heart surgeon, but for me, it was an incredible moment. And I think, you know, I'm a driven person, an ambitious person. That won't surprise you. But what I suppose I've learned since 2012 is to try and enjoy the journey a bit as well, and treasure those amazing moments that you have along the way, because they ain't always going to come back.
Okay. Now, don't go. I have to make the quick closing things. But first of all, to remind people that tomorrow our COVID webinar series, which goes from strength to strength. Tomorrow we'll be tackling genetics and COVID with Melita Irving, Mark Caulfield, and Kenneth Bailey from Edinburgh. So that's as ever, 12:30. Now next week, and I've only just noticed that I'm following directly in the footsteps of Nick Robinson, because after he interviewed you, he went on to interview Jonathan Sumption. And that's exactly what I'll be doing this time next week. Jonathan, lately of the Supreme Court, he'll be our guest next week. He's been described as the cleverest man in England, but some of his views on COVID and public health and how we should end lockdown have not made him the most popular man in England. So read more about that next week. And also to give an advance notice for a big thing we're doing on Monday, the 27th of July, a major event leading lights from around the world, looking at the key clinical learning that we have from COVID. Now, this is supported by the RSM, in order for these series to continue, we do need your support. If you are in the giving mood after this, do please feel free to give. It would be much appreciated. And so now back to you then, Jeremy. Highly enjoyable, fascinating, informative, challenging, and never dull. I knew that would happen. And I am reminded of the thinking of your father, of the senior officer at Sandhurst, who, I think it might be an apocryphal story, but whose report on the junior officer set was that his men would follow him in everywhere, not necessarily because they always agreed with him, but because they were fascinated to see what he would do next. I think we are fascinated to see what you will do next. And in the meantime, we wish you all the best of luck and with what is going to happen to you next. And thank you so much for spending the time. I know your time is precious. We managed to avoid the division bell that ended your FT interview, but now that is it. And thank you, Jeremy, and good night to everybody who has been watching.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to sit on your couch, Simon.
Very good.